pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, knight to c3, bishop to b4, pawn to f3, pawn to d5, pawn to a3, bishop to c3, pawn to c3, pawn to c5, pawn to d5, knight to d5, pawn to c5, queen to a5, pawn to e4, knight to f6, bishop to e3, king to g8, pawn to a4, knight to d7, king to f2, knight to c5, queen to d6, pawn to b6, bishop to b5, bishop to d7, knight to e2, bishop to b5, bishop to c5, pawn to c5, queen to c5, knight to d7, queen to b5, queen to c7, rook to d1, knight to e5, pawn to f4, knight to g4, king to f3, knight to f6, queen to e5, queen to e7, rook to d4, rook to c8, rook to b1, rook to d8, rook to d8, queen to d8, queen to d4, queen to c7, rook to d1, pawn to h6, pawn to g4, rook to e8, queen to d6, queen to c4, queen to b4, queen to c8, knight to g3, pawn to e5, pawn to f5, rook to d8, rook to d8, queen to d8, king to e2, knight to g4, knight to f1, pawn to a5, queen to b5, queen to h4, knight to d2, queen to h2, king to d3, queen to g3, king to c2, knight to e3, king to b3, queen to e1, queen to d3, queen to d1, king to a2, queen to a4, king to b2, knight to g4, knight to b3, knight to f6, knight to c5, queen to c6, queen to d8, king to h7, queen to e7, queen to b5, king to c2, pawn to a4, queen to e5, pawn to a3, knight to d3, queen to a4,